morning, everyone. I'm Brittany Goodrich, a cooperative extension specialist here at UC Davis in the Agricultural and Resource Economics Department. Thank you for joining today. This is the second webinar in our new ARE discussion series. Webinars in this series will take place on the first and third Tuesday of each month. We will host experts from both within and outside of the University of California to discuss issues facing California's agricultural and natural resource communities. This series is being organized by the UC Cooperative Extension Specialist in Agricultural and Resource Economics, spanning 3 campuses. So we have Ellen at UC Berkeley, Mehdi at UC Riverside, and Tina and myself at UC Davis. Just to go over a few housekeeping items, our meeting will run for 1 hour. We are going to have guided Q&A with each of our guests, and then we'll have open Q&A with the audience at the end. So please submit any questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Seminars are being recorded and they'll be available afterwards on our website. So today we have a super interesting session for everyone. We're discussing something that's been on everyone's minds recently, which is wildfires here on the West Coast. We have 2 very qualified and interesting speakers this morning, both with very diverse perspectives. So first, Ellen will lead us in a discussion with Scott Stevens, professor of fire science at UC Berkeley. And they will discuss historical and recent wildfire landscapes in California and the drivers of this year's unprecedented fire events. And then next, Mehdi will talk with Jude Bayham, an assistant professor at Colorado State University, and they'll discuss some of the economics behind how suppression resources are dispatched and how that relates to total wildfire expenditures. So with that, welcome Scott and Jude. Thank you for being here, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Ellen.
Thank you, Brittany. Thanks again, Scott, for joining us. So I was hoping that we could get started with talking about some of the historical context. And I was wondering if you would tell us a little bit about the California fire landscape, what it looked like sort of pre-20th century.
I'm happy to do that. So if we look at kind of fire in this state, we wrote a paper back in 2007 with a couple of co-authors, tried to estimate how much area of California burned, say pre-1800. Of course, ignition sources then would have been lightning and also indigenous burning by California tribes. We have a pretty good tree ring record of fire history through tree ring records that's extensive through the state. And we have oral histories from Native communities that have been passed down through their stories and elders. So when we look at that, we end up with a 4.5 million acre average area burned before pre-1800. And that's actually a very conservative estimate, 4.5 million acres. And the other estimate in the paper is around 12 million acres a year. So when you think about that, I used to say that, that's a pretty large number. In most years in California, we would get between 10 and maybe 35% of that. But this year is the first year we're ever going to approach that 4.5 million. My guess is we'll actually go over the 4.5 million. So I think it just tells us how important fire was in the ecological process in the pre-history of this state when indigenous burning was here for many reasons. So 4.5 million acres is an estimate I think is relatively conservative.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So my second question was to ask you if you could speak more to sort of California's more recent wildfire history, and you sort of alluded that to your answer in putting the historical fire history in context. But if you could just elaborate a little bit more about how it's changed and evolved over time. Yeah.
No, I'm happy to do that. So when we look at kind of the early part of the 20th century, the 19 teens, 20s, that's when we really started to think about fire and its negative consequences were the dominant factor. Back in that period, there was actually large fire years. And then when mechanization and actually fire suppression starts to come up, we see a decrease in fire area. It starts to change probably in the 70s, 1970s. We start to see some increases, and certainly people have written about this, Leroy Westerly and others, where we see a dramatic increase in the 1980s. So we've gone from kind of a period of relatively efficient, maybe fire suppression, where we're keeping numbers relatively stable, to a period now where it's increased. And today, now we're close to 4.5 million acres. And we've had the largest fire in California's history, the August complex in the Mendocino and Six Rivers National Forest, over 1 million acres. And the largest single fire in the Sierra Nevada, the Creek Fire, over 300,000. So numbers have really come up lately in a dramatic way.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about this year and what we've experienced and sort of in what way it is an anomaly. Perhaps if it's, you know, an anomaly in more ways than just like the number of acres burned. Do you have anything to say about putting this year in particular in context?
Yeah, one thing that happened is, most of us in California know, we had that lightning storm in mid-August. You know, that lightning storm came from a tropical depression down near the equator, came up Baja California, Mexico, and then was kind of shifted up based on a low pressure system off our coast. And it put a lightning storm right on top of really the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. And within 48 hours, we had 360 lightning ignitions. So we had 360 lightning fires simultaneous. That's an enormous number. It's not unprecedented though. In June 2008, we had almost the same number. And then late summer 1987, we had another big lightning storm. We seem to get these things, at least in the recent past, every 15, 20 years. But when you get 360 fires distributed simultaneously over a broad area, that's what happened this year with our burning, because we had so many fires simultaneous, they had to be prioritized. Of course, the ones nearest, say, big population centers, like some of them in the Bay Area, were prioritized quickly. Others that were in more remote areas were actually had to be basically put on the back burner, so to speak, because there just wasn't enough resources. So those 360 fires, we've had a couple of human ignitions, but very few of them actually this year so far. Southern California has been relatively mild. Southern California was wetter than average last year, which is interesting. We were drier in Northern California. So I think that lightning system is what basically just overwhelmed us this year. As soon as that happened, we were going to play catch up the whole year. We haven't got enough resources, even with California's #1 staffed and expertise in fire suppression. When you get that many ignitions simultaneously, no system of suppression is going to handle that.
Okay, so I think I caught that you said in 2008 and 1997, those were big lightning years. And am I hearing you say that the difference between those years and this year is because of the way we distributed resources in fighting those fires?
Yeah, it was 1987 and 2000, the June 2006 was the period of the high lightning incidents. And one thing was different this year, there were so many more lightning fires in really populated areas. In the previous two episodes, they were really focused on the Sierra Nevada, Klamath Mountains, and other regions that didn't have that. Certainly people, no doubt, people live there and they enjoy it. But this year we had so many fires right on top of the Bay Area. We had them in Napa County, we had them in San Mateo County, Lake County, Contra Costa County, all those going at once. So that was the exceptional thing this year, is having so many lightning fires in the coast ranges and also the greater Bay Area, and then so many people at risk simultaneously. The other two, June 2008 and 1987, we didn't have that at all. I don't think we had any lightning fires in my recollection in this area. Maybe they were all more remote areas, inland California.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for sort of setting the scene there for us. So now I want to talk a little bit about sort of the various factors that have led to this year that we're having and have had in recent years, and sort of what the biggest drivers of the wildfires are. We hear different things in the news, different things talked about. We know there are various different factors that could be coming into play: climate change, forest management, ecological factors, human expansion and development, human pressure. So is there a way, sort of based on your research, that we can sort of partition the biggest drivers and the biggest factors affecting the wildfires we've been seeing this year and in recent years?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's actually a very difficult one to answer. The partitioning of kind of the fire issues in the state is a challenge, and some people have worked on it. Certainly, others continue to work on it. We're working on it. When we think about that, we really have to talk a little about the particular vegetation types. So, California is certainly diverse, right? We got chaparral, which is a shrubland. We got a lot of oak woodlands and mixed evergreen forests. We got a lot of conifer forest too, say in the Sierra Nevada in the mountains. So I think in the places that were frequent fire dominant, so the places that used to burn every 25 years or less, some places burn every 3, 4, 5 years. Those places have had profound change. When you take fire out for 120 years and then allow other processes to go forward, you're just going to change those systems. So when that happened, I think those systems, the predominant issue is really their structure today. How many trees per acre, how much fuel's on the ground, spatial heterogeneity, things of that nature. So the frequent fire systems, we've had profound change in their structure, which could be basically the same as fuel in many cases. Other places like the California chaparral, a little bit different. The structure there hasn't changed as profoundly. That place burns every 30, 50 years or so with crown fire. And those places haven't had near as much change in a structural standpoint. And you mentioned too, the ideas of ignitions. Ignitions are just profoundly different, right? I mean, used to have, and still do, some indigenous communities, tens of millions of people all over the state, and the predominant ignition source, at least near those population centers, is human. At least 95% of the ignitions in human-dominated areas, the Bay Area, Southern California, San Diego, Los Angeles Basin, it's all human. You go to places like the remote areas of the Sierra Nevada, Siskiyou Mountains, the Klamath Mountains, some of those areas are still 75, 80% lightning. So those two are still real important. And climate change is no doubt changing this, okay? No doubt climate change is having an impact in California fire regimes. We're getting warmer temperatures, we're getting more variability in weather, we're having less snow on the ground. That just means a longer duration for fires to ignite and spread. All that is actually adding to kind of the existing problems that we've taken forward in 120 years. So I would say for the frequent fire forest system, oak woodlands, conifer forest, oak savannas, mixed evergreen forest, I would say by far climate change is less than 50%. I'd estimate it maybe around 30%. And the other factors I would say are going to be the dominant factors we talked about.
Okay, could you elaborate a little bit more on what drives changes in the structure or the amount of fuels?
Sure. When you think about those numbers I mentioned before, 4.5 million acres burning on an average year, up to maybe 12 million in maybe a dry year. When you have that much burning happening in our diverse ecosystems, you're going to change just the arrangement of those ecosystems in terms of plants, habitat. So we know from some data we have in 1911 and others, we have some early forest inventory data in California, and we actually have been able to remeasure those sites. They were actually based on the Public Land Survey section corners, that way we survey lands in the Western US. So you can get data from 1911, which is very close to the transition from fire suppression. Early 1900s is when we began fire suppression. And these areas haven't been harvested at all. So if you look at the data from these inventories, and one thing about these inventories kind of interesting, they're over tens of thousands of acres. It's not like 100 acres or 50 acres. These places basically are sampled 30,000, 40,000 acre landscapes. And you look at the number of trees per acre back in 1911, you see numbers like 40, 50, 80 trees per acre, and dominated by larger trees, pine dominated. And then you look today, and then you look at things like the FIA data or other data sets that you can get, and you see roughly about a 3 times increase in trees per acre in mixed conifer ponderosa pine forest in the state. So that just tells us, we're going from more of a, relatively open forest condition to one that's going to be more dense. And then when you take fire out completely, we don't have the ability then to recycle those fuels that get on the ground. So the fuels that are basically accumulating, the surface fuels that deaden down wood, that just creates a system that's profoundly changed. So that's the kind of data we have that's pretty robust for the conifer forest. Unfortunately, we don't really have that as well for mixed evergreen and oak woodlands. We just didn't inventory those things in the early 1900s. They just weren't, they weren't timber, so we didn't do a lot of work there. I think those have changed profoundly too, but we haven't had that type of quantitative data.
Okay. So I'm curious, given your research, what are some of the most sort of promising strategies for mitigating wildfire risk in the future, and sort of what are the most promising things to do to adapt to climate change and other factors going forward?
Yeah, this is really the crux of it. I think there are two fundamental issues. The first fundamental issue is getting human populations better prepared for fire in this state. When you think about the way we live in this state, a lot of areas are rural areas, a wild and urban interface, people dispersed over many different vegetation types. When you think about that as our infrastructure, and we're not going to tell people to leave, you're not going to get people off their private property. That's crazy, So I think what we have to do is get people better prepared. And I think cooperative extension, University of California, is a profound way to do it. Cooperative extension, it reaches so many things, from range management to agriculture. I've actually advocated for the last couple of years to create a brand new cooperative extension program just in fire statewide. Turns out the state of Oregon's already done that. They did it about 18 months ago. So I think we need to get more people in communities that can deal with helping them prepare, for, better vegetation clearance, better home building strategies, better ways to plan evacuation. I got an 85-year-old neighbor, no car. We're going to make a plan to make sure that she gets out. I got a person down the street that's immobile. We're going to basically make a plan. You got to make a community plan. This is where Australia has done so much better than us. I've done a couple Australian sabbaticals and got to see some of this. So get people better prepared. And the second piece is get our vegetation better prepared for climate change, fire, drought, and where we're headed. And that's also going to be a little nuance from the chaparral to the forest. But then prescribed burning, prescribed fire is certainly one way you can do it. I've done that for a number of years. You can do restoration thinning. You can do managed wildfires. Some wildfires in remote areas really do ecological benefit. So it really is, you got two treatment types, mechanical treatments and fire treatments, and then their combination. That's all you got. So those are the things that we need to go forward. And then certainly things like livestock grazing and other things could be part of it, probably more of a maintenance. But I think you got fire treatments, mechanical treatments are your two main forward elements.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much, Scott. I'll pass it off to Mehdi now.
Thank you, Ellen and Scott, for the great discussion. That's really leads us to the discussion with Jude that works on resource allocation under fire. So Jude, my first question for you is that why is it important to understand how suppression resources are allocated across the fires?
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
I'm gonna share my screen. I have a couple images to help talk through this a little bit. So yeah, I think Scott really did a nice job covering a lot of these issues. I'm gonna try not to repeat any of those, but I think just sort of provide some of my perspective on it. But in terms of why it's important to understand how these resources are allocated, fires happen, seasonally based on sort of weather conditions, as I think Scott did a nice job describing this year's fires, especially in California. Suppression resources are often needed all at the same time. Okay, so that creates this scarcity issue, which creates, frankly, an economics problem. And so what we really want to understand is how to efficiently allocate these resources, across their needs. And I think Scott even mentioned this, that the primary heuristic right now is those that threaten homes and life and property. But so what we want to do is understand how those benefits, those potential benefits of resources on particular incidents, vary across those incidents. And so what we try to do in this paper is construct a framework for thinking about that. And if we can understand that, then we can help forecast resource demands, and obviously the costs accrue to how these resources are used. And I think our model also highlights one important issue, that if we overcommit resources, or maybe overcommitting is even strong, just committing resources to a particular fire makes them less available to respond to new incidents and other fires. And so there's this opportunity cost to any particular resource. And so one of the things, this image I'm highlighting is we've been I know this is the UC, so the focus is on California, but over here in Colorado, we're dealing with several fires, and this is pretty late season for us. This is Estes Park not long ago, and the Cameron Peak fire, which is our largest fire in Colorado history, is moving over. This fire actually about a month ago got 6 inches of snow on it. And that was, potentially an opportunity where resources potentially could have been a bit more active and potentially aggressive, but they were committed to other incidents at the time. So just sort of highlighting this issue that we have to understand how we're moving these resources around.
Thanks, Jude. And what is the role of wildland-urban interface and increased wildfire expenditure?
Yeah, so again, I think this is another point that Scott did a nice job setting up, and I'll just sort of highlight that, over that period, we've seen rising costs. This ends in 2017, but this chart will obviously be higher this year and continue to increase. So I sort of tried to draw the analogy. This is the fire behavior triangle. Topography, weather, and fuel, all lead to, all impact fire behavior. I sort of tried to construct my own little version of this and talk about it as the fire management triangle. In the literature, this is well recognized, that, we have this confluence of the wildland-urban interface, or WUI, as we'll often call it, forest management, historical management practices, and this intersection with climate. And so as these factors lead to more severe fire seasons, we are, as a society, as the fire management agencies, are responding to that, and really with this goal of protecting life and property, they are going to require more response. As we've seen in some of these large incidents, these resources aren't always just used for direct suppression. They're not actually, fighting the fire. And in certain cases, there's nothing you can do. Noted just about a week ago on the Cameron Peak fire in Colorado, they were seeing up to 80-mile-an-hour winds on the ridge tops, and you have to get out of the way. And so a lot of these resources are devoted to helping people evacuate, trying to help facilitate safe exit from these dangerous areas. So all of these things conspire to increase costs.
Thanks, Jude. Can you highlight a little bit more on the figure in the middle? What was the total federal
this
spending?
one?
Yes.
So this is just, I think it's from
yes.
a newspaper article a couple of years ago. This is the last year is 2017, and this is really just the trend in federal firefighting costs. So notably, this omits CAL FIRE, which spends, at least a quarter of this, probably alone in California. This is going up to $2 billion. I haven't checked the current expenditures this year, but I suspect, I don't know, Scott, if you know them, but they're going to exceed these levels, and I'm pretty confident.
Oh, thanks. What is your economic model? Can tell us about the resource allocation across the fires?
Yeah, so let me jump to this slide and actually have this a little bit animated to help facilitate the intuition. So what we were trying to do is capture some of the salient features of how resources are actually allocated across incidents from the national level. So or even within a region. So the fire management system at the federal level, it's actually a collaborative effort between the Forest Service, which is under the USDA, but also Department of Interior agencies, which include the Bureau of Land Management, Park Service, and others. So what happens is once an incident begins, an individual or an incident commander or incident management team will be in charge of operations on that particular incident. They will request resources based on expected needs. So, let's just assume we have 3 incidents here. This one, these two notably are in, I'm just choosing pictures of, obviously very intense crown fires, but here where we have an incident that's near, some development, some property, and presumably people in these homes. So these incidents will request resources to their regional command. That actually may get passed up to a national command. And then this pool of resources, let's assume we have this pool of resources here, they will then get allocated to these different incidents. So, they all requested packages of resources, and this, in this example, I'm sort of highlighting that incident 2 will receive more resources because there are more values threatened.
Oh, very interesting. Thanks. And what type of data did you use for your empirical analysis?
Yeah, so we use primarily data from the ICS 209. These are incident reports filed approximately daily, sometimes actually more than once a day, by incident commanders or incident management teams on the ground. Here's just a sample of fires. No surprise where they are geographically located, and notably these reports are going to contain information on daily outcomes. So the cost, which is an estimate, the estimated fire size, the number of threatened homes, and actually other structures by type. These forms used to include this information for growth potential. They've actually discontinued that, but I use that in this analysis. And then notably, these are larger fires where these 209 reports are required. And I focused on fires that were designated as full suppression, so that I'm comparing apples to apples. We also integrated census housing data and weather data as controls.
Okay, great. And can you tell us a little bit how did you analyze this data?
Sure. Yeah. So we really we wanted to exploit the panel structure of this data. So the fact that we have these increments or these measurements over time within incidents. And so I'm just sort of set up this graphic to illustrate, one of the challenges here is we're trying to parse out the effects of some of these factors, like the number of threatened homes, from expectations about fire growth and these other features. So this just sort of gives a heuristic for how we're understanding this, that we have these sort of beliefs formed about future potential growth and damage, and those are obviously impacted by weather and other, the topography and the fuels involved. And then so these sort of requests are made at this time period 0, you can think of, and then requests are allocated, or resources are allocated in this time period 1, and then those result in costs and certainly affect future fire growth. So, just sort of general perspective, we're constructing a regression model that tries to exploit this timing of decisions and the fluctuation in weather to isolate these impacts.
Oh, thanks, Jude. And did you find in your results that fires with threatened homes attract more resources?
Yeah, so that's perfect setup. That was kind of one of our high-level results, that we see that fires that threaten homes, this is in thousands, so 1,000 additional threatened homes, they receive more of these type 1 crews, which would be your hotshot crews, the highly trained, somewhat more autonomous crews. We actually, oddly enough, find a small effect, negative effect on aircraft, but we find a positive effect for the home value, the impact of aircraft. So those offset a little bit. And then an approximate 7 additional engine crew members, which is a little over one engine crew. So the way you can approximately think about this is 1 type 1 crew per day, 1 engine crew per day for every 1,000 homes threatened. And then I think one of the other notable results in the paper is that we can actually estimate the impact of other fires in the region. So this is this sort of resource constraint piece that I discussed at the beginning. So we see that when there are other fires within the region, a particular fire is less likely to receive type 1 crews. And this is just highlighting this resource constraint and that we have this resource scarcity problem.
Thank you. And then so far we talked about historical wildfires. Can you tell us, or your results can tell us about future resource allocation decisions and projected housing developments?
Yeah. So one of the things we tried to do with this model is try to project out, based on estimates of home density growth, actually, and we largely focused in California. So we can take our model under the assumption of more additional homes. If we take that estimate, we can, essentially calculate the number of additional resources that would be allocated to these fires at some costs from Cal Fire estimates to arrive at an additional cost in the future. In this case, we chose 2030. I think I want to emphasize that this is actually probably a low estimate for a number of reasons. One, we're looking at historical fires. As we've discussed, the fires may differ. We may have more larger fires in the future for any number of reasons. So this is actually a fairly small estimate relative to the overall budget. This is the 2017 Cal Fire budget. So I also want to highlight that you can visit my website, and I have this version, this map in sort of an interactive version. So you can see the housing density changes going from, the yellow is essentially no change all the way up to 300% increase in home density. And you can turn on layers for all fires in the area. And then the subset of fires that we estimate would have 1,000 additional homes. And if you hover over that, you can see the additional cost that, based on our estimates. So just a little plug.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Jude. I think with that, I turn it over to Tina for the question and answers from the audience.
Do you want me to stop sharing?
Yes.
Sure, that'd be great. Thank you, Mehdi, and Jude and Scott and Ellen for the whole discussion. One question that we'd like to lead off the Q&A that's relevant for both Jude and Scott would be, what policy recommendations do you have based on your research and your experience? I think everybody right now is looking for answers right after this unprecedented wildfire year. So what kind of guidance and recommendations can you offer?
Scott, I was going to let you go first. Yeah.
Okay, sure. It's interesting. Right now, there are 3 bills in the U.S. Senate that are all a little different, and some of them I think really have some interesting ideas. One is Dianne Feinstein. Dianne Feinstein put a bill in about 2.5 months ago. And one thing I think that Feinstein's bill does pretty well, it kind of tackles the problem both on the private side, kind of the private landowner side, and also the wildland side, which is primarily, federal, sometimes industrial landowner. So I think this idea of the wildland urban interface, as Jude's alluded to, is huge. I mean, you're talking about people's lives, livelihood. So it's a logical place to begin, thinking about how to change. So Dianne Feinstein's bill, one thing it has in there is a grant program, existing grant program for the U.S. Department of Energy to try to have people make their houses more energy efficient, to actually change that, to actually also try to make them more fire resistant. So you could actually incentivize or provide some ability to get people to actually do a little better in the way they build. She also has information in there to try to maybe increase fuels treatment at the landscape scale adjacent to some of these communities. Interesting, Senator Harris's bill focuses exclusively on the wildland urban interface. And she says, well, we want to fund more community groups to make fire protection plans. I applaud that, but I think we also have to work on the wildland side. If we just work on purely the urban interface area, just where the houses are, we also have adjacent areas that are really vulnerable to fire. I think we got to do these things together. So I would say that ideas of trying to mesh both the private wildland urban interface areas along with more of a focus on wildland areas and doing it together as an integrated package is one thing I think in policy we need to do.
Yeah, I'll tack onto that a little bit, but I absolutely agree, and would also sort of layer onto that. Economists tend to think about incentives, and we have to think about the incentives, faced by people that want to live out in these communities and either build or maintain homes out in the wildland urban interface. California had a fire prevention fee, I think it was called, a couple of years ago, and it recently, I think, became a bit of a political football, and maybe there was it was put on pause for a little while. But I think what that started to get at is this idea that that there are some additional costs posed to the fire management agencies, and indirectly to society as a whole, for developing the wildland urban interface. And I'm not the only one to write about that in papers. There are several great papers out there. I think I noticed some of those folks on this call, or on this webinar. So I would encourage others. I'm happy to plug those papers. Michael Taylor's on this call, I saw.
So thank you both so much. Jude, following up on your answer, I think one thing we would like to touch on based on some of the questions in the Q&A is private resources. So as I understood your paper, you were just looking at federal costs of fire suppression. How are private resources interacting?
I can't hear the audio right now.
Uh-oh. Am I back?
Yes.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Perfect. Sorry about that. Not sure what happened. So a follow-up quickly for Jude. As I understood your paper and the research you presented, you were focused primarily on federal resources. Can we talk a little bit about private resources and how those could be hopefully allocated more efficiently, and how kind of that private fire sector interacts with federal resources?
Yeah, I'll just preface this with, now I'm sort of speaking outside of my paper, and so not on behalf of John Yoder, my collaborator on that paper. And I think they private resources can represent an important piece of the puzzle, but I think it's also important to recognize that there is a potential for the sort of too many cooks in the kitchen type of event, where you have conflicts between federal or state resources and private resources. I think they're well, actually, John and Dean Luke have a nice sort of description of the history of fire management and how that evolved. And I think there are reasons why we've moved to a more sort of government managed fire suppression system. So yeah, I see both sides of it. I certainly see why people want to be able to hire private resources, but I think there are some common goods problems that arise from that.
Sure. And so both of you mentioned in your policy recommendation section talking about incentives. And so we actually have a question from Ethan Ligon, a colleague at UC Berkeley, asking about homeowners insurance, specifically in that wildland urban interface, and what prevents kind of the expense of fire insurance in those areas from kind of solving this incentive and resource allocation problem. So I'll kind of leave that open to both of you if you each have opinions.
Scott, go ahead.
Okay, again, I think Jude, you probably gonna have more to say about this, but fire insurance in this state is becoming a real interesting issue, and one that's also incredibly important to people, because tens of thousands of people are losing their fire insurance. You know, I know a lot of these folks. You get a letter in the mail, they just say, sorry, we assess this area as a high fire danger area. They're very general. So some folks that I know that have gotten these letters have taken real actions around their homes to try to reduce their vulnerability. They've done vegetation management. They've actually done better with their construction materials. Maybe they even have a water source that's independent. I mean, really taken efforts, but they still get this general kind of assumption that they're in a bad area and they're going to cancel insurance. So the state has certainly walked in California to provide like a bare bones insurance. Not a great person to answer that. I don't know, Jude, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I'll take over and say that, yeah, I think, Scott, you made some nice points, and my father is one of those people who got one of those letters. He's up in the foothills, just sort of northeast of Chico, California, and yeah, that question, I assume, came from an economist, because that is, you know, sort of our first thought about solving these problems. And I think what this recent wave of insurance cancellations suggests is that you know, there's some there just seems to be a collapse in that insurance market. So insurers are not willing to insure. I think the risks are just too high. And so that doesn't mean that there isn't a market price, and that you know, that we should let that price emerge. But it seems like an abrupt shift in, you know, in a lot of these homeowners were paying for insurance, and I think essentially there was a reassessment of that risk in recent years, and I think we've seen pretty big jumps, Scott, as you alluded to, in the premiums, and then the you know, much lower coverage. So you know, maybe that, well, it's certainly should be a thought as we think about policies moving forward. So I think it's a good comment, and should be part of the discussion.
Yeah, thank you both. A lot of us have been observing maps of overlays of burns over multiple years, and there's been a lot of media coverage asking, okay, well, this area burned just 2 years ago. How are we seeing burns here again? And so that relates to a question actually from Kelly Duckhorn, asking how we actually leverage burned areas and severity of burns to create a more sustainable fire landscape in the future.
Sure, I'll go maybe, then Jude could follow again if you'd like. But I think that's an interesting point. I think that there is enough areas burned now in some areas that you could use those as anchors to do maybe your proactive prescribed fire. You know, I had a colleague come over from Australia, Rick Sneejak. Rick actually was the head of fire management in Western Australia, Perth. So they have a tremendously large prescribed fire program in Perth. At one time, they used to burn close to 1 million acres a year in the greater metropolitan area of Perth and outside, you know, dozens of kilometers. It's gotten smaller now for some reasons. But when Rick came here, you know, a number of years ago, he says, you know, you really need to train a workforce to do this. You don't really have the workforce capability. And I agree, we don't really have the workforce capability. He also said, you start out with one of the most difficult landscapes imaginable because you have such a continuous area of high fire hazards over so much area. You lack that kind of mosaic that you just alluded to in your question, because the mosaic will allow you then maybe to burn next to something, burn at maybe an area, have the ability to predict that maybe a fire is not going to move in there is easy, especially under prescribed fire conditions. So as sad as it seems, these big fires that have actually started to sculpt our landscapes in ways that are really terribly undesirable, loss of life, loss of tens of thousands of homes, they could be used to actually anchors in a proactive program to the future. In fact, I'm going to give a talk in the Napa region in about 10 days. And frankly, it's exactly what I'm going to talk to them about. There's enough burning that's happened in the greater Napa area today that if you're interested in things like wine and also trying to remove smoke taint on grapes, I think the only way you do that is you burn out of season. You burn in spring, you burn in winter when the grapes aren't susceptible, and you reduce that vulnerability. So I would say, yes, some of these fires are going to be opportunities to do that. And as you said too, some of them will have grass in them, so they're not going to stop a fire because you could burn it again 1 year later, but it's going to be a lower intensity fire, one that you can probably manage better. So I think it's going to be on earnest, as crazy as it sounds, that maybe I think we need to use more prescribed burning and use the wildfires as anchors and go forward.
Yeah, just a short comment on that. I've read a few papers trying to assess the impact of fires that burn into previous burn scars, and I think it does. It depends on how long ago that previous fire occurred. It does seem to have impacts, reducing severity. Although in the Cameron Peak fire here, we saw the Cameron Peak fire blew through the High Park fire scar, and that fire occurred in 2012. So it's not like just because you had a burn, you can expect zero fire there. But I think Scott makes some good points about using that as an anchor for treatments and proactive mitigation.
Sure, definitely. One of the interesting features of our landscape in the West is federally owned lands. So about 50% of California's landscape is federally owned. Can you each talk a little bit about how you suggest we work with these federal agencies to manage these generally forested lands to hopefully mitigate fire risk in the future?
Want to go first, Jude?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I'll make a few comments. I think that's one of the key questions moving forward. In my experience, and I do work with folks in the Forest Service. I think there is a lot of motivation to engage in active management, but there are a lot of barriers. I mean, I think one of the things that we've talked about several times already is just this idea that we can treat landscapes, and I think Scott did a nice job describing. It's really two options: mechanical treatments or prescribed burning. And there are barriers to both. Mechanical treatments are very expensive to treat the amount of acres that we're talking about. We're talking about large, vast landscapes. Fire, while cheaper, is subject to air quality standards, and so there are constraints on doing both of these things. And I think the federal agencies are recognizing that the need to be more proactive, but I think we have to think about all of these things when we talk about policy and designing policy that acknowledges the costs and benefits of all these activities.
No, I would agree with what Jude said. And when we think about kind of California, one thing that's happened about a month ago, we had our Governor Newsom sign a MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with the Forest Service chief to say that they wanted to treat collectively 1 million acres a year annually by 2025. So the goal would be to collectively 500,000 on the federal side and 500,000 on the state and private side. So that's certainly incentive for the federal side to really work. And I think one thing that the first slide that Jude showed, I think, was just the cost of fire suppression. it used to be back in the mid 90s, if my memory is right, I think the cost of fire suppression for the US Forest Service is about 15 to 20% of its budget. So the mid 90s, maybe 15, 20%. And this year, I believe it's at least 55%. So 55% of its total budget is just for fire suppression. When you put that much money into that activity, you of course are going to reduce the capacity to do other things like the proactive work we're talking about. Another part of this, I think, is a real challenge, is when you think about doing this and addressing these issues we've talked about, you know, it's really going to take some time, you know, and it's not like 2 years. It's probably like 15 to 20 years. You know, it's really going to take us an investment of ideas, political capital, economic resources in a plan that is going to eventually make a difference. But I hate to say it, but it's not going to make a giant difference for a few years. That's a hard thing to sell, you know, but I think we're at a point now where my view is this, you know, look what's happening, you know, look at the costs, look at the damage and just livelihoods of people. It feels like we have to basically engage in a longer term strategy. And if we don't do that, both in the WUI and also maybe in our wildlands, I just don't know if we're ever going to be able to get our hand on this problem.
And a little bit of a follow-up there to the federal lands question. How about what's the role of private lands owned by timber companies? Obviously, the lumber industry in California is far below what it used to be, and they're obviously highly regulated. What do you feel like the role is for the timber industry to help us solve this problem, if any?
I'll say a couple comments. And yes, I think that, you know, industrial private timber owners in this state are really important. I believe the largest landowner in the state is Sierra Pacific Industries, which is actually a very large timber owner. And I know that they take this idea seriously of trying to think about fire in the future, you know, and trying to think about how you manage lands that are less vulnerable. There are other companies that we have even age methods and uneven age methods. So we can think about kind of even age or kind of more like the clear cut harvesting, modified clear cut harvesting. And we also have uneven age systems where we're doing more selection harvesting and group selection, things like that. Both of those have inherent probably benefits and challenges, you know. So I think timber companies in this state are profoundly interested in trying to think about how you go forward. Because you can imagine, you know, it's really their capital, you know, and many folks in this Zoom are going to know a lot about capital than I do. But I do know just from the North Complex fire that burned from Bucks Lake, Plumas County down to Oroville, it burned through an immense amount of Sierra Pacific Industries land, huge amount. I haven't seen the numbers yet, but it's big, it's very large. So that's a huge impact to their company. And I think in some ways, inevitably, it's going to take a cooperation between probably a federal landowner adjacent to the privates, working a little bit more collaboratively to try to get a landscape that's actually less vulnerable to severe fire. I think right now there's snippets of that going on, but it's pretty small. So it feels like it's got to be more of an integrated planning of the private federal to come together along with the WUI.
Yeah, I'll just tack onto that. The sort of economist perspective, you know, is also recognizing these spatial spillovers, that you have these land holdings that are adjacent to public lands. They might be owned by the state or the federal agencies, and so the coordination, you know, across these landscapes is you know, is also an important piece, and that's just hard. You know, it's hard to get everyone on the same page, you know, making the same decisions. But I think that's where some of the policy Scott alluded to earlier can help facilitate that.
Okay, I think we're coming up on our final question, and actually this is circles us right back to the results that Jude presented in his model. This was from Michael Taylor. State and federal suppression efforts subsidize housing growth in the WUI. What do your results tell us about the size of this subsidy?
Yeah, Michael, that's a great question, and you know, it's a hard one to get at. You know, I'll say that my analysis was sort of geared at like the flip side of that, right? Looking at how you know, that WUI growth impacts the resource allocation. You know, I think yes, some of your work and Baylis and Boomhauer paper does a nice job, you know, sort of framing that subsidy. So in terms of a cost, I don't think I can really throw out an estimate there. But the intuition there, just to sort of flesh that out, is that you know, if just the mere fact that we're providing fire suppression activity in these areas, you know, inherently means that people that want to live in those areas face a lower risk of fire, because there is some implicit guarantee that there will be some effort to suppress fires in those areas. So yeah, recognizing that is certainly an important piece. And this goes back to the incentives that we were talking about.
I just might add just one really brief thing. I think I saw the federal government just approved to cover 75% of the suppression costs reimbursement to California. President Trump just did that the other day. And I think some of the, maybe some of the fires are even closer to 100%, you know, reimbursement. So in some ways, it also goes all the way to the ladder to the feds, you know. So if FEMA is going to basically subsidize 75% of suppression costs, you know, for the state, and this has been going on for decades, you know, where's the accountability there? It feels like to me that there's got to be some more local accountability, you know, and I don't know how to do that with an incentive, but it feels like now that accountability is basically almost a little elusive.
Okay, thank you both so much. I'll turn it over to Brittany to wrap us up.
Yeah, so thank you both. That was a really interesting discussion, and I'm sad that we're at the end of it, but just wanted to thank both of you for being here, and then also thanks for all of the attendees being here as well. We have the next webinar coming up is November 3rd, and so that's going to be covering the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So we're going to have a couple of economists, Dr. Dave Sunding from UC Berkeley and Dr. Matthew Feinup from California Lutheran University, and they're going to be discussing the role and design of groundwater markets. So that should be a really interesting discussion as well. So thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you again next time. Check out our website for any of the any information on the upcoming webinars. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.